Britt Bunyard, welcome to the program.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Britt Bunyard is the founder, editor, and publisher of FUNGI Magazine. He's the Larry Flynt of the mushroom world. And today he'll be teaching us the naked truth about mushrooms and fungus, because much of what you probably think you know about the subject, you don't. So with that said, Britt, what is the biggest misconception out there about fungi?
Oh, wow. That's quite a question. Well, based on my logging into Facebook quite a bit over the last year or two, I guess maybe the biggest myth is that you can eat just about any mushroom in the forest because everyone seems to be posting photos on Facebook and blogs and websites and stuff about all kinds of mushrooms and asking, can you eat this one? And, of course, 99% of the photos are cell phone photos that you almost can't make out what's even in the photo, and there'll be people who I don't even know who these people are chiming in saying, oh, with conviction it's this and that, and yeah, definitely eat it. And I'm thinking, I don't know what it is, but I know based on a couple things about it that it's not edible. So that might be the biggest myth right now, is that you can pretty much eat everything, which you sort of could. Most mushrooms are not dangerous, but the vast majority of mushrooms out there in the forest, wild mushrooms anyway, are simply not good to eat at all because they taste horrible or they have horrible texture or smell or, they're tough as wood or rubber. So, unless you have a little bit of knowledge, it's unlikely you'll find very many really choice edible mushrooms. But for some reason right now, I guess it's the foraging craze that's really hit North America. Everyone wants to find mushrooms and pick them and eat them. And every single one they encounter, they're pretty sure that it's going to be a good one to eat. So maybe that's the biggest myth right now.
Well, what would be the rough percentage of what's poisonous versus edible?
That's an excellent question. And in fact, I give a lot of lectures at museums and mycological societies and, just all sorts of events and natural history museums and nature centers. And it just runs the gamut. Everyone seems to be really interested in mushrooms right now. And I usually bring along PowerPoint slide or two on the exact topic you're asking about because I get this question so often. So of the thousands of described and named species of mushrooms we have in North America, there's about a handful or slightly more than a handful, so, like 5 to 7 or 8 species, and that's it, that are actually dangerously poisonous. There's probably a few dozen or several dozen that will, have a good history of giving people GI problems and gastric upset. And then likewise, there's about a similar number out of all those thousands of mushroom species out there. There's about a similar number of really choice edibles. It might be maybe twice the number of mushrooms you should avoid. So maybe 30 or 40, maybe 50 species of really good edibles in North America that people that are really knowledgeable look for. And then all the rest of the mushrooms fall in between, which I sort of touched on a second ago. They, for the most part, you could eat them or choke them down, but no one would want to, and you probably would not seek that same one out again just because it was a waste of time. If it's not as good tasting, frankly, as store-bought mushrooms, why go through the trouble of driving hours and getting eaten by mosquitoes and hot and sweaty and everything? That's sort of my gauge as to whether or not I'm going to go after certain mushrooms, is if it's not better than something I have growing at my house or I can get in the grocery store, why bother? So in any case, there are not that many species of dangerous mushrooms. A lot of people are worried that there are just lots and lots of dangerous mushrooms. There's not that many. However, I will say this, despite the fact that there's just a few species, mushroom poisonings happen all the time, and in North America, people are killed by poisonous, deadly mushrooms just about every year. So despite the fact that there's not that many, you certainly could encounter them. And the most deadliest mushroom, or at least that causes the vast majority of all the deaths in the world, occurs where you live in the Pacific Northwest. So it's known to occur in Vancouver and BC and Washington and Oregon and California. So it's certainly out there, and they occur in urban areas too. They're not like something that occurs only in an old growth forest. I mean, these are mushrooms that have moved around. This is Amanita phalloides that I'm talking about, the death cap. It's moved around with horticultural plants, and so it's been planted. Well, the tree host has been planted on, on city streets and things. So you don't necessarily have to go real far to encounter some of these deadly mushrooms. So that's a word to the wise.
You said many of them they're too tough. They're kind of, you wouldn't want to eat them. Are the deadly ones, are they edible? I mean, do they taste good, or would you know pretty much when you're eating them that this isn't good?
Yeah, that's also an excellent question. And so, the mushroom world is quite a bit different. If you have a little bit of experience as an outdoors type person, or you watch nature shows or whatever, the mushroom world, the kingdom of fungi, is a little different from most other kingdoms with regard to toxicity and advertising that fact. In the natural world, a lot of organisms that have evolved toxins, deadly toxins especially, have done so as an antecedent. Plants have toxins in them to ward off all the different insects or grazing mammals. And if they're really poisonous, they often advertise that fact by bright colors. They don't rely on cryptic colors and camouflage to hide from things that want to eat them. They actually have a toxin that will prevent stuff from feeding on them, and usually broadcast that effect. So a really good example is like milkweed, which has a really serious toxin in that milky latex called a cardiac glycoside. It basically stops the heart from beating of animals. And so you'll see very few insects that can feed on milkweed leaves. The very few species that you do see, like milkweed bug, which is actually a beetle, or monarch butterflies, or a few other things, all have very bright colors, orange and red. And so it's believed that organisms that somehow can figure out a way to detoxify, basically through a chance mutation, well, now they have an excellent food source because they're the only thing that can eat that. And at the same time, those insects sequester that toxin in their tissues and will pass it on to something feeding on them. And it's an even better idea than that to go one extra step of having bright colors so that stuff, rather than bites you and maybe injures or kills you before spitting you out, other predators will see those warning, or we call them in evolutionary biology, we call those warning colors aposematic coloration. Those predators will remember that color and just learn to avoid things that are toxic out of hand. So there's all kinds of brightly colored plants, parts of plants, and fruits and flowers that can be really bright colors, reds and yellows and oranges, and poisonous snakes, poisonous fish, insects, usually broadcast that color and warn things ahead of time. Fungi are sort of the opposite. The dangerous mushrooms really are not brightly colored. The most dangerous mushrooms we have in North America and, in fact, the world, usually are kind of drab colors like browns or tan or white. The death cap I mentioned before is kind of a sickly yellow-green color. It's actually kind of pretty depending on what you see as pretty in mushrooms, but other dangerous species related to the death cap, the destroying angels and things like that, those are all completely white. And then there's some gallerinas that have the same toxins. They're not really closely related to amanitas, but they have the same deadly toxins in them. And they're just really small brown mushrooms that just kind of live out of the way. So a lot of people suspect when they see really bright red, orange, and yellow mushrooms growing on their lawn or on a hike in the woods, oh, avoid those because I've learned stuff in nature has these warning colors. Well, it doesn't work fungi that way. They don't seem to broadcast the fact. I can't think of any really yellow or red mushrooms that are dangerous. There's quite a few edible species that are yellow or red. And likewise, the dangerous mushrooms don't have foul tastes. I've tasted, pretty much all of them. It's perfectly safe to take a very small little taste in your mouth just to get it on your tongue and see what it tastes like and then to, of course, spit it out. But we identify a lot of different mushrooms this way by different flavors or smells or things. And I can tell you that the dangerous deadly gallerinas and amanitas, they all actually taste quite good. And I think that's part of the problem with the Amanitas is it's a big showy mushroom that people see quite a bit, and it looks like something they might have seen in the grocery store. It doesn't have those bright colors. There's no foul smell particularly. They cook it up, and it's not real bitter or acrid or whatever, which would cause you to spit it out. It has a very pleasant taste, very nice mushroomy taste, and you end up consuming the meal, and of course, then that's when the real problems start. So, but anyway, sort of to answer your question, no, there's nothing really about them to suggest, other than their appearance. If you know how to identify mushrooms, there's nothing from their appearance really that would warn you this could be a dangerous mushroom, than so much the color or the smell or the taste or anything.
You just mentioned the foraging for mushrooms is becoming really popular, but I've heard a lot of people mention that they avoid mushrooms now because of the pollution. Apparently mushrooms absorb toxins and heavy metals from the environment. Is it true that mushrooms are, in fact, possibly poisonous for this reason, due to the pollution?
Yes. In fact, there's been a long-held belief that mushrooms can pick up heavy metals and stuff like that, but without a lot of real good evidence. Up until fairly recently, the magazine I published, FUNGI Magazine, we had a multi-year study done by some people in the Northeast on morel mushrooms that are quite popularly collected from old apple orchards in the eastern part of North America. And some people were worried, those orchards a long time ago, for decades, were sprayed with lead arsenate to keep mold pests and insects and things off the apple trees. And they wondered if the morels could become toxic by picking up the lead arsenate. And so there was a study on that. And it turns out it's probably not as big a worry as a lot of people thought. However, on the flip side, it was just recently found in an ongoing study that some mushrooms called Gomphidus, it's a fairly common mushroom in the forest, especially in the Pacific Northwest, a very, very common mushroom in the forest. If you're out looking for different types of boletes in late summer or fall, you'll see these because they're kind of associated with a number of boletes. And a lot of people do pick the Gomphidus to eat. I don't find them to be particularly tasty. They're kind of slimy, but they are a really big mushroom, and you can fill your basket in no time. There's an ongoing study right now that's just found that they can pull lead and I think maybe even another heavy metal from soils. Even soils that don't really seem to have a lot of heavy metals or things in them, they somehow seem to sequester and build up high amounts of. And likewise, there's a number of other hazards. There's radionuclides from, if you lived in an area, say, near where the Chernobyl accident happened in Ukraine and Russia. Contamination from the fallout of that got into all sorts of things, of course, cow's milk and a lot of wild animals, but also quite a few species of mushrooms that there's a really big industry of picking wild mushrooms in Europe and Asia and then exporting to Western Europe a lot of these species, and they found that some of the species were extremely high in radioactivity. And, of course, that's especially dangerous because you're buying these things in a market dried in France or Spain or the UK, and, why would you suspect that it might have radioactivity from halfway across Europe? So stuff like that's a hazard. There's also been some studies that have shown mushrooms harvested from lawns and things can pick up all sorts of other pesticides that are put on lawns, and just the fact that the lawns are sprayed, I mean, they might not necessarily have stuff inside of them, but they could have sprays and things on the mushroom. Mushrooms picked along roadsides, that's something that usually people kind of avoid just because of all the air pollution that's being blasted right onto them from automobiles and road salts and stuff. So, yeah, that's a very good point. And it doesn't just have to be poisonous mushrooms. It doesn't just have to be some species of mushrooms that can pull up heavy metals or other toxins from the soil. It can be things in the urban environment that can get into them or settle onto them that can also give you problems. If you've been eating wild mushrooms for years, no problems. Now, all of a sudden, a batch of something you've picked for years and years and years, and you know exactly what it is, now it causes some gastric upset or worse, that can put you off mushrooms when, in fact, maybe it was just they were picked from a bad area. One other thing, in a lot of different mushroom guidebooks they caution some of the wood rot mushrooms that grow off of different trees and rotting wood and stuff. There's some species of wood that people have cautioned against picking mushrooms from. Rhododendron is one example. There's a couple mushrooms.
Hemlock.
And hemlock, too. People have said they're suspicious that maybe, this sulfur shelf mushroom that they pick off of all different types of trees in the Pacific Northwest. Wow, I had a batch last week, and I didn't feel right, and someone told me that if it's on hemlock, it can pick up some sort of, a toxin from the hemlock trees. And I think that's probably true. There's quite a bit of anecdotal evidence, and a number of books talk about stuff like this. So, again, that's just one more thing to kind of watch out for if you decide to get in on this foraging business.
And it can be a business. There's huge money in mushrooms, right?
Oh, yeah. There certainly can be. I mean, I know quite a few people that do this commercially, and that's how they actually make their living is from foraging wild mushrooms and some other things. And if it's in the Pacific Northwest, of course, truffles are worth a lot of money, so I know some truffle foragers, too. And
pine mushroom.
Yeah, pine mushrooms, right. Yeah, I was just poaching. Well, I don't want to say poaching, but I was borrowing some of your BC pines just a few weeks ago, and even I hope no one from the U.S. government was there, even brought some back to Wisconsin to enjoy, and so quite nice. But yeah, I mean that mushroom's worth big bucks in age. That's led to all kinds of other shenanigans going on. Anytime you have something worth a lot of money, there's theft and crime and shootouts and stuff can happen over it. So it's amazing how. What an industry some of these mushrooms are worth. Now, having said that, any listener out there thinking, wow, I can make quick money doing this, I certainly would not want to make a living that way. It's definitely hard work, and you go out some days and find a basket full, but you go out a lot of days and you don't find a single thing. So, the people that are doing this are working really hard. So, more power to them.
Is it true that you shouldn't eat mushrooms raw, and then when you cook it, that takes out any of the toxins?
So, that's discussed all of the time in mycological societies and mushroom clubs and things. They usually caution about certain types of mushrooms, that have certain types of spore colors or looks about them. If you're a beginner, avoid things that look like this until you get a lot more proficiency. And another thing they usually preach is not to eat any wild mushrooms raw, and I don't subscribe to that. There's a few wild mushrooms that I really enjoy raw. The main reason for not eating them raw is they're highly indigestible, much like plant parts, right? So plants are made of cellulose. We don't have, they're not just made of cellulose, but they're very, high percentage of the tissue there is cellulose. We don't have cellulase enzymes. No animals do. So no animals can actually eat plant parts, especially that are really high in cellulose, like grass and wood and stuff like that. No animals can eat that stuff and digest it and live off of it. So there are a number of animals that do seemingly eat the stuff like termites and cattle and things, but they benefit from microbes being in their gut or even eating wood and other matter that's already been partially digested by molds or other microbes that do have these cellulase enzymes. Of course, we don't, so any plant material we eat tends to be more starchier and less high in cellulose. At the same time, we're still ingesting a lot of indigestible matter there. We just call it fiber, and anyone who's gorged themselves on apples or carrots or any plant part, especially the higher fiber parts of plants, you can get GI upset or diarrhea or things like this just because you're eating a lot of indigestible matter there, and it's going to pass right through you. And mushrooms will have the same action. If you gorge yourself on mushrooms, even cooked mushrooms, you can have gastric problems. And so that's the reason for telling people to pretty much eat cooked mushrooms. They're just a lot more easily digestible and probably more nutritious as well. The cooking process breaks down a lot of the chitin, which is what mushroom cells are made of. The cell wall of mushrooms is chitinous, and they can't digest that too well. It's a compound that's pretty similar to the material in, arthropod exoskeletons like shrimp and crab and stuff like that. And of course, you can't eat that without any problem. If you ate a lot of it, you might get, it's a lot of roughage, it's a lot of fiber. So that's primarily why you should cook mushrooms. There have been some studies that have shown there's a number of different compounds in mushrooms that in very high amounts, they could be toxic to you. In low amounts, it's not a problem. And so cooking breaks those down. And, yeah, that's probably true as well. But I think the main reason for advising to cook wild mushrooms is it just makes it more digestible and safer to eat if you're going to be eating very much of them. I mean, everybody listening has probably eaten sliced button mushrooms raw on a salad, or enoki-taki mushrooms raw on a salad or as a garnish or something, and of course it's not a problem. If you ate a whole basket full, well, it would be like eating a whole basket full of apples. You would probably have things going on explosively out the other end. Who knows? So, anyways, but I mean, if you overindulge in anything, I mean, you have problems. So, in Europe, just as an aside, in Europe, one of the absolutely most popular wild mushrooms is the Caesar's amanita, which I mentioned dangerous amanitas before, and there's quite a few species of amanitas that are perfectly safe to eat, and one of which is the Caesar's mushroom, which is probably the most popular mushroom after porcini mushrooms in Italy, and I don't think Italians would ever think of cooking that mushroom. It's always turned in kind of a salad with some other raw vegetables, and the dish is called ovuli, and it's basically raw Caesar mushrooms sliced up on top of the salad and a little really good olive oil and some squeezes of lemon juice and a little coarse salt, and that's all you need. And it's absolutely just about the best mushroom dish I can think of. And again, it's a raw mushroom, so it just depends. Some mushrooms, for sure, you really need to cook to bring out the flavor or improve the texture or whatever, but not all of them. And that's how plant parts and fruits and nuts and things go. I mean, sometimes they're best eaten raw, or sometimes best baked or roasted. It just depends on the thing is you're dealing with.
Are mushrooms more or less dangerous than plants? In other words, if I were to randomly pick a mushroom and randomly pick a plant, which is more likely to be poisonous?
Oh, that's funny. So, well, first off, I should point out that all plants, every single plant, is poisonous to something, and so are mushrooms. And so now, of course, everyone's scratching their head. Wait a minute, now, am I hearing this guy right? So, over the millennia that these organisms have had to deal with stuff wanting to take bites out of them, of course, these organisms have evolved all sorts of antioxidants and poisons and things like that. Now, having said that, probably the top 10 chemical compounds naturally produced that humans absolutely could not exist without, those are all toxins to insects or molds or other things. So things like nicotine is a very potent insecticide, and, obviously that's why people are smoking tobacco, is because that compound that's a poison to insects is an addictive drug to humans. It's also poisonous to humans, too, in higher amounts. But in lower amounts, it's an addictive drug that people can't seem to live without. And likewise, all sorts of other different sterile compounds like cocaine and things like that. I mean, these are caffeine. These are compounds that are probably in the organism. They're extremely bitter and somewhat poisonous to insects and other things, so they're probably made by the organism to fend off all sorts of predators, and we've keyed in on them. All of the sulfurous tasting, smelling compounds in all of the brassicaceous vegetables like cabbage and cauliflower and stuff, those are quite poisonous to insects, but that's what we consider to be the flavor compounds of cabbage and things like that, why we eat it. So in any case, mushrooms the same thing. They have all sorts of compounds that don't seem to bother us, but are probably poisonous to other molds and insects and things like that. And in fact, some of these compounds are the flavor components and also can even be, are thought to be associated maybe with medicinal properties and anti-cancerous compounds and things. So which are more poisonous to us, plants or mushrooms? It'd be hard to say, but It very well could be plants. I mean, there's an awful lot of plants out there that, if you ripped off parts of plants while you're walking through the woods, most of the things you'd stick in your mouth would probably taste foul because of some sort of an antecedent compound, or it's just not going to be very digestible. So it very well could be that plants are going to be maybe a little more poisonous to us than fungi, but you have to kind of consider what that means to be poisonous. Stuff that's poisonous to some things isn't necessarily poisonous to others. I'll point out also with these deadly amanitas, the compound in them that will certainly, or it certainly can, be lethal to humans and other mammals is not lethal to all kinds of other organisms. There's all kinds of insects that feed on those amanitas, flies and beetles and slugs and things like that. With impunity, they don't get harmed by them. So, it's sort of interesting that a chemical that's one organism's poison is another's, savory flavor component.
Now, with that in mind, if you were to notice deer grazing on some mushrooms, don't assume that means they're edible for a human.
Yeah, that's definitely not a good assumption. And, if you go, here's a lecture on edible mushrooms or flip through any guidebook on edible mushrooms, right at the beginning, the introductory stuff, it always talks about some of the stuff I've already mentioned about as far as what to look out for, and it'll discuss some of the myths that people have held, not just in North America but all over the world, as to how the surefire way to know mushrooms are safe to eat. If you are cooking them with a silver spoon and the spoon turns black, that means for sure they're poisonous. Or I've even seen the reverse. If it did not turn the spoon black, for sure that means they're safe or edible or whatever. And that's just there's no truth to that whatsoever. And likewise, the animals, other mammals eating the mushrooms, like squirrels, or feeding stuff to a dog first to see what happens, or there was a patch of Amanita muscaria, that red and white showy mushroom in the Pacific Northwest being fed on by deer, so I decided, well, it must be safe. Well, that's not a good idea, because could be a couple things going on there. One, those could be poisonous to you, but not poisonous to some other animals, and there is evidence of that. Squirrels and things can eat stuff that will poison us. And likewise, how do you know the animal didn't get poisoned and die from it? The toxins in amanitas don't take effect until 6 to 12 hours or even longer later. So you feel perfectly fine for quite a long time. So the deer or squirrel could have ambled off and be long gone. You would never know it, So, and then that's when the trouble starts. So just because you see other animals or even other humans eating a mushroom, for that matter, that doesn't necessarily mean it's safe. The only surefire way to know whether wild mushrooms are safe to eat is to simply know what you're picking and know what it is. There's no color or taste or smell or other animals eating it or silver spoon or anything. There's no way to know other than to know exactly what the species is you're eating. So people join mycological societies. Of course, Vancouver, where you live, has a fantastic organization, and it's quite a large club, but there's other ones in Alberta and Washington State and my state, Wisconsin. They're all over. And this is the best way for beginners to get involved, is not simply just to decide, I'm going to pick up the guidebook and go out in the woods, because you're going to get frustrated that a lot of stuff looks really similar to you with your beginner eyes. But also, you really do run some risk of poisoning yourself. And also, as I mentioned at the outset, you actually run an even bigger risk that you're not going to find anything worth eating because you don't necessarily know when and where and how to look. If you join a club and go out with experts, you'll quickly learn how to tell one mushroom from another and to do it safely, and it'll just be a lot more rewarding and safe experience. So, yeah, if you see deer right now eating mushrooms, it's pretty common in several parts of the country where it's still mild and the deer are kind of running out of food, but that doesn't mean anything. That doesn't mean that they're safe to eat for sure.
You're far better off just shooting the deer.
Absolutely. And in fact, With the flavor of most mushrooms, it's really not that great. Certainly I'm crazy about some wild mushrooms, but most of them are not that great. Deer, I've never met a venison sausage I did not like. So, yeah, if you can find mushroom-fed deer, that's probably a safer bet.
How do mushrooms propagate? Are some mushrooms male and some female, like plants?
Well, that's another excellent question. And, to say that plants are male and female, of course, it's not like male and female that we think of with animals. Plants do sexual reproduction a different way. And also plants reproduce asexually and vegetatively as well, which with humans, that doesn't happen. There are animals, of course, that do different types of reproduction than humans. Humans have kind of really the sort of the simplest, most, least exciting, most boring type of reproduction really in all of the world. There's a lot of other organisms that do a lot of really interesting things when they reproduce, and fungi are a great example. So anyways, you asked about the gender thing. Are there males and females? So how fungi work is there are definitely genders in sexually reproducing fungi, and they're not really going to look any different. They just have different sort of mating types. So we know that one of the benefits of sexual reproduction is in getting different genetic recombination, so that you have a lot of genetic diversity, and it's beneficial because you can potentially develop new traits, over time in your population that might help you in changing environment or to, seek out different food sources or whatever. There's all sorts of reasons why you want genetic diversity. To fend off diseases right now is a biggie in some organisms. They're losing genetic diversity. They can't fend off diseases anymore. So whereas humans have only two genders, and as you pointed out, male and female, fungi don't really have the male and female thing. They just have mating types. So a lot of fungi have 4 genders. That's pretty common. I can't really think of too many that only have 2. There's quite a few with 4, and there's a number of fungi with 8 or 16 or hundreds of genders. So that's kind of wild and mind-blowing to a lot of people that, when you went through high school biology or you watch nature shows or, if you're moderately interested in science, usually when you talk about genetics or reproduction or sexual reproduction, usually it's kind of animal or even especially human-based. So when you hear that there's organisms out there where there's hundreds of genders, what does that mean? That's hard to get your head around. But basically what it means is it's a really, really good idea if you are an organism that subscribes to sexual reproduction is a good thing. Having more than 2 genders is a better idea. So, for example, a human walks into a human bar on a Friday night. There's about 50-50 male and female gender representation in the bar. So, all things being equal, if you are deciding it's time to reproduce, you have about a 50% success rate. Depending on how attractive or gruesome you might look, about a 50% success rate come out of the bar at the end of the night with a compatible partner. But with fungi, that wouldn't happen. Fungi walks into a fungus bar, and it's almost 100% likely you're going to leave at the end of the night with a compatible mate because, there's just so many different genders. It would be rare in a fungus like that to run into someone of the exact same mating type or gender, if you want to call it that, just because there's a lot of different types. And the reason for that might be that with the way fungi reproduce when it comes to sexual reproduction, the end product is going to be these little spores, which are like super tiny seeds that are going to waft around on the currents of air and sort of they're at the mercy and vagaries of the wind. Where they're going to land, you might not land anywhere near someone of your kind. So on the odd chance you do, you'd hate to be the exact same gender as them, and you're just out of luck. Where if you have several hundred different mating types, if you happen to land, your spore happens to land and start germinating and growing into that substrate, the chances are not pretty great you're going to run into someone of your kind, and then you can sexually reproduce again. Now, having said that, an awful lot of fungi, maybe most fungi, don't do sexual reproduction very often or maybe ever. Asexual reproduction seems to be very popular in a lot of really common and aggressive molds and plant pathogenic fungi and things we encounter in the around the home and garden and forest. So these fungi probably can reproduce sexually when they feel like it or if they're stressed or who knows why. But most of the time they're not doing that. They're simply just cloning themselves and making asexual spores and blowing those around, and those settle down, start growing, and in just a few days or one day, they can make more spores, and they can really spread really quickly and build up their numbers really fast. And so, like I said, a lot of our economically important plant diseases are fungi that reproduce this way, and you can see an advantage to not bothering with sexual reproduction, and that's why a lot of fungi just pretty much simply rely on asexual reproduction, just sort of cloning themselves. And then there's even another group of fungi that don't do either. There's a lot of common fungi around that don't seem to ever reproduce sexually or asexually. They just kind of grow and break apart at times because of wind or water or what have you, and that's how they seemingly get around. It's kind of mysterious, but they're quite common. So if you're only used to animal reproduction, or in particular human reproduction, that's kind of boring. A lot of other organisms out there do a lot of other really radically different things that are pretty cool, and fungi sort of take the cake. I mean, they really just, they mix it up and do reproduction pretty much any possible way you can imagine. So it's pretty neat.
How old can some of these organisms get?
We think that a number of fungi can live for thousands and thousands of years, and that's based on, there's fungi that can live in really super old growth trees, and you can kind of, I guess, see how long the fungus has been invading the tissues of these great big monster trees, and so those can be quite old. There's fungi that are found in forests that when people have sampled on one side of the forest and really, really far away, literally acres away, even hundreds of acres away, they found the exact same organism, and that was based on looking at the DNA. So they found that it was the exact same organism covering these huge swaths of forest. And well, you can cultivate the fungus in the lab under ideal conditions and see how quickly it grows and kind of extrapolate that if it grows, so many inches in a year, that it would take, would have had to have taken thousands of years for this fungus to grow across the forest. Likewise, there's fungi that grow on your lawn. No doubt you've seen these that form fairy rings, these sort of bright green rings or arcs on the lawn. That's a fungus that's kind of growing through the thatch of the grass in the soil. And some of them, I think, are rotting the thatch. Some seem to act as kind of like a weak parasite. But in any case, they grow, they start out from a spore and kind of grow outwards in every direction. And sort of like a fire, they just kind of keep eating their way through the soil and litter in the soil, and don't really seem to grow backwards because I guess they've already exhausted the nutrients and whatnot right behind the growing edge of this fungus. So they grow ever outward at, fairly slow rate, just a couple inches maybe per year. And if you've been watching in a neighborhood where you've lived for a long time, you've probably seen some of these rings getting bigger and bigger, maybe 4 or 5 feet across. But you can go out to the Great Plains in the central part of North America and see these fairy rings that are miles across. In fact, there's fairy rings you can see from planes, and I've seen photos from planes, from airplanes over the plains of these massive rings. But I've also read that some of them are so monstrous that they can only really be seen from outer space. So obviously something like that would have had to have been growing for thousands of years as well. So it's kind of neat to think that something so small and seemingly kind of fragile could persist for a really, really long time. But we know there's other organisms on the planet as well that can live for thousands of years. Obviously there's some trees, but there's other things as well, some sort of lowly, slow-growing, old, really, really ancient, primitive types of plants that can grow for hundreds of thousands of years, an individual plant, thousands of years in deserts and really arid areas or very cold areas. So it's obviously not unheard of that fungi could do this as well. Certainly longer than I plan to stick around, that's for sure.
Just a couple audience questions here, Britt. Does your guest have an opinion on kombucha in terms of benefits and risks?
Benefits and risks of kombucha. So it's interesting about this kombucha, which is a kind of a tea that's made from sort of a colony of a few different microbes, and they're not all, from one kingdom. There's some bacteria, there's some fungi in this mix, and some of the mixes that people have come up with commercially, I think, are even maybe proprietary, and it's maybe not even known exactly what all is in the mix. So people have been using stuff like this as a sort of a medicinal supplement to their diet for a long, long time in other parts of the world. This sort of kicked in and became really popular, it might have been maybe 20 years ago or so, not all that long ago, in North America. There's big craze, and a lot of people got onto this and were making these kombucha teas. And that was sort of the heyday of it in North America. And there were quite a few risks then, based on the fact that there were a number of people poisoned that I heard about. And I think the reason why is because people growing this stuff at home often didn't really have an appreciation for sterile technique and microbes and other stuff that can fall into this thing and start growing, because there's nutrients and sugars and stuff in there that a lot of different microbes can grow on. And, of course, the ones you're wanting to grow, they're producing and sort of excreting into this tea a number of properties and compounds which seem to be helpful and maybe even medicinal and important in the diet. But, some of the things you didn't intend to get in there, different molds, can make mycotoxins, which can be extremely dangerous and deadly. We didn't even touch on those. I mean, people worried about deadly mushrooms probably aren't that likely to encounter them. But a lot of people are actually likely to encounter mycotoxin-producing molds in spoiled food or farmers unwittingly feeding it to livestock and what have you. It can be in all sorts of areas, especially a lot of natural and seemingly wholesome-looking stuff. It could be contaminated with mycotoxin-producing fungi. Anyways, with the kombucha, after some fairly well-publicized poisonings a few decades ago, it seemed to kind of wane, and you didn't hear about nearly as many people doing the kombucha anymore. Now, just recently, it's come back, and it's not just among people growing it at their house. There's now lots of companies producing it in factories and bottling it under, completely safe, pasteurized conditions. And I've of course drank homemade kombucha tea made by other people. I've never really gotten into making it myself, but I've certainly drank it numerous times that other people have made, and I'm perfectly fine with it. I think it's probably good as long as it's made under safe conditions. And I've also even drank some of the commercially prepared ones, and they also seem to be quite tasty, and I'm sure they're every bit as helpful as the homemade stuff, and I'm sure it's got to be safe too, because stuff like that is overseen, and people running factories, I think, probably have to have some skill in aseptic technique and microbiology and things like that. So as to whether or not it's safe, again, it depends on the person making it, of course. If you understand how if you have reverence for other microbes and how there's microbes all around us, we're breathing them in all the time, and they land on our food and stuff all the time, and that's how things spoil. And if you're pretty careful, then of course you probably don't have any risk in growing it yourself. But if you're kind of a sloppy person with dirt under your nails and you have a propensity to contaminate food that you serve to other people, or don't wash your hands after you use the bathroom or whatever, you probably will end up contaminating a batch of kombucha and might be in for sort of a bad surprise and getting sick at some point. But I don't really know that much about it. I'm not an authority on medicinal mushrooms or kombucha, but it's kind of neat, and it's neat that people can grow stuff at their house that can have health benefits. You don't have to rely on pharmacies and things like that all the time for food supplements and vitamins and things. You can make a lot of this stuff yourself.
I actually have Robert Rogers on the show in 2 weeks from now. He wrote The Fungal Pharmacy.
Yeah.
Do you know the guy?
Oh, yeah, I know Robert very well. Robert Rogers, yeah, The Fungal Pharmacy, I mean, that is the book on not just on medicinally important fungi or nutritionally important fungi, but it's just a great book on all kinds of mushrooms in the forest and a lot of really interesting ethnomycological stuff. I think that's really, make sure you ask him a lot of questions about ethnomycology.
Maybe you can call in that day and ask him a question.
Well, yeah, maybe I will. Yeah, ancient uses of fungi and also just uses of fungi around the world by all sorts of people long ago as well as to this day. Robert Rogers is our medicinal mushroom writer for Fungi Magazine, and he has a regular feature in there all the time. And again, I think his knowledge is super vast on all of those topics. But where I think he really far exceeds anyone out there is his knowledge on ethnomycological uses of fungi in North America and the world. So I mean, he's a real treasure for North America, and it's a coup for you to get him on your show. He's a brilliant person.
Listen, we should talk about your magazine, Fungi Magazine. It's beautiful. The pictures and the information are quite unique. How does the audience get a copy of this?
Oh, well, it's pretty easy. So Fungi Magazine, we're going to be starting our 8th year in print, and it is a magazine for general audiences. So we have a little bit of technical stuff in there once in a while, but usually it's stuff that anybody with any interest in mushrooms or wild mushrooms for cooking or photography or really anything would have an interest in and could read the articles. It comes out 5 times a year, and it's easy to get copies or subscribe. You can just go to the website, which is fungimag.com, so FUNGIMAG.com, and you can sign up there or buy individual copies or see parts of back issues. We always have the latest issue on the homepage of the website with some of the articles full text on there for free that you can check out and see if it's for you. But it's quite popular, and I think the popularity is due to the fact that we have lots of really slick, shiny, large photos of really pretty fungi, but we also have all kinds of interesting information on wild mushrooms, but also cooking with mushrooms or preserving or fermenting stuff with mushrooms. It's really just anything goes. We had the fall issue is still being shipped, and we had a big section on 3D mushrooms with 3D glasses and everything. So, I mean, it's academic stuff, but it's also just wacky, fun stuff as well. Pretty much anything goes.
It's not available on newsstands, though. You must order it through the website, correct?
There are a few stores that do sell it on stands, believe it or not. But not very many. They're usually really large kind of mushroom specialty stores in large cities. So like Far West Fungi in San Francisco carries it, and you can buy it on the rack there. But there's not that many stores around that have it. And, of course, we ship it to your home and everything, so you don't have to hop in the car and go get it. It comes right to your door. So that's the way that 99% of everybody out there that gets it does get it. Or if you check out if you live in a town that has a really large library, or especially a university library, some libraries get it. You can check it out that way. But otherwise, yeah, people pretty much just subscribe. It's not terribly expensive. It's $40 for a subscription to the U.S. and $42 to Canada, so not terribly expensive.
Will the increase in the popularity of mushroom picking harm mushroom populations? And is there any such thing as an endangered mushroom?
Is this another question from a listener?
No, it's another question from me.
Oh, I see. So the reason I asked is because this is a pretty hot debate right now. We've had sort of counterpoint debates in Fungi Magazine on and off over the last couple of years because there's been a huge upsurge in interest by just the general public to look for wild mushrooms. There's been a huge upsurge in commercial pickers because the demand has skyrocketed in restaurants and markets for wild forage mushrooms. And likewise, the enrollment, the membership of mycological societies and mushroom clubs has been going up quite a bit as well. So, and as you know, the habitat's not getting any bigger. The habitat's going down. So there certainly is a greater amount of pressure on mushrooms. So a lot of people think that maybe we should close areas to mushroom picking altogether, or do something about it to make sure that these populations are not being depleted. So based on what little scientific evidence there is, and there's not much scientific evidence, there's been a fairly often cited study done in Switzerland that has looked at mushrooms in this one large, well-established forest. Over 30 years, they've picked every single mushroom. Every single mushroom, I guess they go out every week, I think. Over 30 years, picked every single mushroom, edible or otherwise, and they've not found any change in the number of mushrooms coming up the next year based on species or variety or anything. It doesn't seem to matter that much. And there's been a study on chanterelle picking, which is a very popular commercial and wild-foraged edible mushroom in North America. There's been a chanterelle study for about the same amount of years. I think it's been 25 to 30 years in Oregon. And they go out to this forest and have all these plots in the forest where they pick every single chanterelle, literally as soon as it comes up over years and years and years. And they also have not found any depletion in the number of mushrooms coming up from one year to the next. What they do find in these studies is trampling by people and soil compression does seem to reduce the amount of mushrooms, but also seems to reduce, their plants and things too. And, well, that seems to make sense. If you're compacting the soil and trampling stuff down, you're doing a whole bunch of damage there. But it doesn't seem to really matter too much. If you go to forests in Europe, they look very different from the forests in North America. A lot of the forests there are surrounded by urban areas, and the forests are very clean looking. The trees are big, but there's not a lot of small understory plants, no bushes or things really, and there's no wood lying around or anything. So it's very open, and any mushroom that comes up you can spot easily, and they pretty much all get picked. My guess is that mushroom comes up, and assuming it can be up for a few days, that's long enough for it to blast its spores into the air. And so if you pick it, pretty much doesn't matter. It's already done its job and released a bunch of its reproductive propagules. But even if it doesn't, the fungus itself, the business end of the fungus, is still underground growing on whatever it's growing on. If it's a rotter of stuff or if it grows on, if it's a mycorrhizal fungus and is a symbiont of tree roots, it's still in the ground and it's still growing, and we don't even know, maybe a lot of them reproduce asexually or by other means as well besides producing fruit bodies. We don't really know a lot about a lot of fungi yet. So it doesn't seem that overpicking is too big of a deal for most mushrooms. Once they come up, they blast the spores. The one exception that I can think of is with matsutake mushrooms, which I would call the pine mushroom down here in the U.S. Matsutake or pine mushrooms, it's a species of Tricholoma. It's this mushroom that occurs mostly with pine trees, and it has such a high dollar value in Asia, and in particular Japan, that there's really a lot of pressure to pick every single one of this species when it's found. And in particular, the very young ones that are still in the button stage and haven't opened up. And when they haven't opened up yet, they haven't had a chance to drop any of their spores and reproduce. And so there is documentation of a number of areas in Japan and elsewhere where, because of year after year of people picking every single one of these buttons before it has a chance to open, that does seem that the population is diminishing. And I'm not entirely convinced it's just the picking. It's probably also due to degradation of the habitat as well and less favorable conditions for the mushroom, because matsutake grows in a little different manner than a number of other mushrooms, and so some other things can affect its habitat. But it doesn't really seem that overpicking, and I hate to say that as a naturalist and ecologist, that it doesn't seem like there's, that much of a worry of overharvesting, just because, that just doesn't sound good. But it seems to be pretty much true with fungi. You're taking all of these mushrooms out of the forest. Well, the fungus is still underground, and you probably didn't get them all anyway, and so one mushroom can produce thousands and thousands of spores. And so it doesn't seem that after years and years of heavy pressure on different patches of woods that, most of the species seem to keep coming back. There's other bigger threats for sure to mushrooms than the picking. It's the loss of habitat and global climate change and some of these other bigger things. If I was listeners listening, I wouldn't be too worried about overpicking the mushrooms. I would be more worried that other things are going to impact the mushrooms and the habitat than, your dinner of wild mushrooms.
I have one last question, and I apologize to the other members of the audience who had questions that I didn't get to today. We've just run long. Britt, why do mushrooms grow up when they have no means of photosynthesis?
Why do mushrooms grow up? Wow, these questions. Where are you getting these questions? Why do they grow up? Well, this is a philosophical question. First off, that mushrooms and other fungi don't need light. That's not entirely true. Most probably don't need light. For sure, a lot of commercially grown mushrooms, like button mushrooms, are grown underground in caves or other areas where they certainly do not need light. But there are some mushrooms that actually do need light to form fruit bodies, and it's not because they're photosynthesizing, just as you pointed out, which is how plants make their energy. Fungi get their source of energy from other sources. They're not a primary producer like a plant. They have to either rot things, rot other primary producers, or they act as sort of predators or parasites and steal goodies from other organisms or kill them outright. So, and that's how we get our energy. We are not a primary producer. We have to eat things that were primary producers or eat things that ate other primary producers. So the reason that they grow up is probably two or threefold. The thing that you see is a fungus. Again, the main part of the fungus is out of sight. It's growing inside of a tree, rotting the wood, or it's growing in the soil, rotting stuff, or it's coming up from the roots of trees because it's a symbiotic partner. And in fact, that mushroom you hold in your hand that's the size of a baseball or half the size of a baseball or the size of a French fry, I mean, that's probably a really small part of what that organism looks like. It could be, in the case of wood rot fungi, in great big old growth trees in the Pacific Northwest. I mean, that fungus could weigh hundreds of tons. A single individual organism could weigh hundreds of tons. So what you see is just a small part of it. It's just the fruit body. So the idea of the fruit body, of course, of the mushroom, to get up into the air column so that when the spores are ejected from the fertile surface of the fungus, if it's a gill fungus, it's from the gills. If it's a bolete, it's from the tubes underneath. So when it drops its spores into the air column, the higher up you are into the air, of course, the greater the distance that the spores are probably going to waft away. And that's the main reason for growing up and getting into the air column. But there's also a little bit more than just that. So the surface that the spores are coming off of has to be oriented in a way such that it's exactly perpendicular to the soil or to down, and that way the spores will not fall against another gill on the other side of the mushroom or against the walls lining these tubes, in which case it wouldn't go anywhere. So it has to be up and exactly perpendicular to down, to the ground, and therefore the spores will have a chance to get away. So, when you grow plants at home, you can do fun little tricks like have a light source and make them grow towards it, and they'll be bent. Fungi aren't really going to grow towards a light source like that. They're typically, just as you point out, they're going to want to grow up. And in fact, you can do little tricks with your mushrooms. If you find Amanitas as an example, which it's in the Pacific Northwest, it's that big red showy mushroom in summer and late fall with the white patches on it. If you pick that big mushroom and put it in your basket lying down flat, you'll probably notice in 24 hours that the upper half of the stem will be bent back upwards, and it'll look kind of like a tobacco pipe, because it's wanting to reorient itself back upwards. Or maybe you saw these Ganoderma artist conch or other types of conch shelf fungi on a fallen piece of wood, and the shelves seem to have little shelves going in the exact opposite direction. That's probably because the log was rolled or something, but it was still alive, so it grew another shelf out trying to reorient itself to what was down. So that's pretty much the reason why they're growing up. They also can be growing towards an oxygen source. There's more than one reason why they might be growing up. If you're growing mushrooms at home, like shiitakes or oyster mushrooms, and they're inside of a bag culture or something, you poke a hole, they'll grow towards that oxygen. And if you seal that hole and then poke a hole on the opposite side, they'll actually kind of snake around and develop a real long stem trying to get back towards that oxygen. So there's more than one reason, but for sure it's not the same reason as why plants grow up, which is, as you pointed out, to get up into the sunlight so they can photosynthesize.
Britt Bunyard, hey, great show today. How can the audience get in touch with you if they want to learn more about your research?
Listeners can get a hold of me one of a couple ways. You can simply go to the Fungi Magazine website. There's a place on there that says Ask Fungi Magazine, and if people post photos to get mushrooms ID'd or have questions or whatever, or they just want to chat or whatever, that's one way that they can find me. On the Fungi Magazine Facebook page is another way, and that's probably your best way to get questions answered and mushroom pictures ID'd and stuff, because, I mean, people go on there and post stuff, and people are chatting about stuff basically in real time. That's really fast. But also you can get a hold of me at my email address, which is fungimag@gmail.com. You could send questions or comments or whatever that way. So either way will work. And I'm online quite a bit, so I usually am pretty responsive.
Britt, it's been an honor. Thank you so much for being a guest on the program today.
Sure, it's my pleasure. I like nothing more than talking about and picking mushrooms.